Hi everyone, welcome. Today we're talking about what game should you start with so that you know where to start making your video game progress, and we're going to go through some ideas. We're going to take questions from the community. We've got Tim, got Laurie, got myself, Rick. So first of all, let's start off with what it means to start your first game. Let's assume you've gone through a course or two, you've watched some YouTube videos, you know a little bit of how things working, and you're ready to do something on your own, not just literally following a tutorial, but you're ready to dabble in something. I think the theme that's going to come through today is simple and small scope. I want to start our conversation by introducing you to the main concept that I want you to have in your head when you're talking about creating your first game. And that's to think not about a game, but to think about a moment. So we can talk about that for just a moment. Damn, I didn't want to do that, but we went there. So if we're talking about a moment, what does that mean? So throwing to you, Tim, what do you think when we talk about creating a moment? We'll call it a 2-minute moment for simplicity's sake.
A moment is a series of time units. And I have a graph on this.
Oh my goodness.
I think a moment is kind of the core experience of whatever you're making, right? So in a platformer, the first moment might be running and jumping, or in a shooter, it might be moving and shooting. Kind of the core kind of mechanics of whatever you're building. Now, it's not just the core mechanics, because if you're building a fun experience, a fun little moment there, I think you need a little bit more than just the core mechanics. You need basic enemies in. You need to showcase kind of the world a little bit. You need to kind of showcase what this kind of game can be. It's kind of like a sandbox. Is that what you had in mind, Rick?
Yeah. Well, let's bounce around moment. It's really critical that we get this concept, because without it, people jump into UIs and enemies and sound effects and all that kind of stuff, and 7 levels and 20 characters you can pick from. So, okay, Laurie, let's use you as the example here. Let's pick a genre that you could make as your first game. Something nice and simple.
I'm making a puzzle game.
Puzzle game. Okay, cool.
Just starting.
Puzzle game, which I personally, this is going to be great. We've got some contention. I would never recommend making a puzzle game as your first game.
Terrible idea.
That's because this guy is terrible at puzzles. I'm like, I don't know how to do it. So, but let's, for the sake of viewer participation, people in the chat can give us some input as well. Let's talk about a puzzle game, because Laurie's wanting to make that as her first game. Well, as a first game. What would be one moment in a puzzle game that you could create? What do we need to have in there? What elements? First of all, can you describe for us what you're doing in this puzzle game? It's so broad, puzzle game. Why'd you choose puzzle game?
It's not an escape room. I'm not going into the specifics, but it's basically you're stuck in a room, a house, and you're trying. It's not puzzles, but it's like you're exploring and trying to find your way out.
Okay, what are the cameras and controls? This is a really important place to start when you're talking about making a game, that you at least know camera and control. So we're talking, is it first person? Are you hesitant to give away your idea?
Is anything top secret here? Like, we can pick a different example.
We don't need to sign an NDA.
I'd say first person mostly, but I want to do some of the Cinemachine stuff, like in the RPG course where we like zoomed in every so often. And I think you can do that even with the first person. I think that makes it more interesting.
Okay, and are you moving around? Are you clicking? Like, is it a mouse and click type thing? Like a...
No, I don't believe in those type of games. Okay, it's moving around.
Believe in them.
Okay. So let's say, so that Laurie doesn't feel like we're stealing her idea, let's say that it's a really simple first-person horror type puzzle game where basically you're trying to figure out how to find the key to put in the door to move to the next thing. So for me, a moment would say, okay, I need to control how I move. I need to have a key. I need to put it in the door. The player can play that in a minute. There we go. I've made a moment. And you can make it and say, okay, what do I need to do to make it more interesting? Well, the camera controls are kind of a bit bad. Let's make the camera a little bit better. That's a bit better. Okay, the room's a bit empty. I need more things in there. Do I need an enemy? No, I'm not ready for that yet. I need to hide the key a little bit better. When I grab the key, I need it to go ding. So you know that's important. When I put it in the door, it goes boom. That's important as well. I've made a 1-minute moment in my game. And if you enjoyed making it, and if people enjoy playing that 1 minute, and they're like, is that all? I want more. Then you know you can make more of that as a game. So Whew,
Yeah.
I think we got there in the end. Tim, did
So-
I even explain that remotely okay?
I think so. From what I got from what you said, you kind of want a set of base mechanics, and then you want an objective or a goal, right, to complete, and then you basically want them to be able to complete that goal or objective
In 1
and that's
minute.
kind of the moment. Right.
In 1 minute. And this is the problem that when we get there and say, okay, I'm going to make a real-time strategy game. Okay, well, I need a player select. I need to select units. I need to put down my base. I need to have resources. I need to have enemies. The enemies need health. This becomes so gigantic. So if you're working on your first game and your moment requires 10 different systems, then I don't think it's a good first game. This is what I'm trying to get to in this theory, this philosophy that I've got about the moment. So a good first game, you can make a 1 minute moment and it's fun and interesting. And you're not getting there and saying, but there's no enemies, so this is dumb. Like you say, this actually feels appropriate.
Right. And so I think that leads to kind of what we commonly say don't ever make when we use like an MMO as an example. And one of the reasons why an MMO is an example is because of all the systems you need just to get the moment, right? You need multiplayer, you need backend code, you need UI, you need the action combat system, you need your friend to play with you. You need a lot of stuff just to be able to see that moment play out. Whereas in a puzzle game, you don't need a lot. Matter of fact, there are some puzzle games that are super simple aesthetically. They're, look at Baba Is You. It's a great example of like it's a complex mechanic, but it's like visually very kind of simple. And there's a lot of things you can do with it. The other advantage or kind of disadvantage of puzzle games, both ways, is the advantage is the mechanics don't have to be super complex or crazy hard to implement. A lot of it can be in level design or hand placed objects. Yeah. So if you're not super programmatically inclined, you can build basic puzzles with just kind of thinking through how the player is going to react to different stuff. So that's an advantage. The disadvantage, on the other hand, is that because it's so handcrafted and because it's one-off puzzles, players can never play those again because they know the solution. And it does take quite a bit of time and energy to, build those because they all have to be done by hand.
Yes. Maybe we can do something here. Humor me with this, if you guys will. And sorry for hijacking the direction we're going in with all this, but if we can design just the most simple, basic aspect of our very first game. Let's take a 2D platformer, because we kind of know how to make those. And what I'm going to do is something a little bit trial and error-ish here. I'm going to pop this on the screen, and we're going to create it. Hello, Photoshop. So what we'll do is, if you guys can tell me what we would need to do if we're making our very first game and it's a 2D platformer, what do we need to have in here? And keeping with the concept of creating a 1 minute moment. As we said before, why a 1 minute moment? Then you don't accidentally create a game that's got too many systems in it, as Tim was saying. What do we need to have in our 2D platformer as the bare minimum for us to make a game?
I like a button and a door.
Okay, so it's just a big screen with just a big button and a big door. That's the game?
Well, I think this is where the mechanics come in, right? Like let's say the button's hard to get to, or the button doesn't seem accessible.
What do we need before a button and a door?
Well, we need a player.
Okay, cool. That's where I'm
Is that where you were going?
That's where I'm going out with all this. Okay, so
you were right there, Tim. That was the right.
I assume player was involved in a 2D platformer, but I backed up a second.
So the very first thing you need, nearly always games start with what you're controlling or who you are. Okay, so player, what do we need next in our 2D platformer?
Platforms.
I think it needs a face. That's what I think.
Okay.
It's like a little heart
face. There we go.
Okay.
And hair.
Okay, so then we need some platforms. And obviously, if you're making platforms, then you need collision and you need all that kind of stuff. What do we need our character to do in our platformer as our kind of minimum stuff?
Run and jump.
Like movement.
Okay, movement, excellent, thank you. So, run and jump, movement.
How did you draw a straight line like that? That's impressive.
I held down shift.
Oh, you cheated. Okay.
Yeah. And
I
then
was gonna
so
say I'm impressed.
left and right and jump. Do we need anything else at this stage? Like dark or shoot or any of that kind of stuff in our 1 minute moment as the minimum we're making for our very first game?
Probably not.
Probably not. Okay. Enemies
Unless
in our
it
1
is a
minute moment?
shooter.
If it was a
How
shooter,
about
well, we
this
can work on
answer?
we can work on a shooter next if someone wants to start off with a shooter.
Well, I was
But
gonna say it could be a shooter platformer, I guess. How about a
yeah.
player and a simple objective, like Racket says?
Right. So
Okay.
this is
Yep.
where the decisions need to be made, right? So like, is the enemy to kill, or is the objective to kill an enemy, or is the objective to get out of a room? Is the objective like what do you want the objective to be? Or what?
Okay.
Yeah, exactly what AJ said. A goal is a level end.
So
So
in
you gotta
our
think about that.
in our little game here, what do we want the objective to be? You were talking about doors. That's a good one. So you can either, I think, at this point, because this isn't much of a moment. Well, you know what? You could just have this as your 1 minute moment. You're just jumping around, wee, and then you could have the game being some sort of like avoid the spikes. That could be the game, the 1 minute moment. So you're basically going from A to B. There's no indication that you've won. It's just here's A where you start, and here's B where you've got to get to. And you've got jumping, so you've got to jump, and not fall on the spike. So then you would need some sort of consequence if you land on the spikes. Oh, so I'm on the wrong screen, and my tablet's sideways, and anyway, it's all writing skewed.
Excuses.
Miguel Caldera, maybe, says risks, which is kind of what you're talking about with the spikes, right?
Risks. Yes, consequence. So I think it's really, really important in your 1 minute moment to have a couple of things. You've got to have decisions. How do I get a different color here for this? So instead of this blue, let's make it a green. So I think you need to have decision, and you need to have consequence, and you need to have, what was that last one we were talking about? Like an outcome, a win, a goal, a target. Like a
I would say so.
goal. Goal.
A reward at the end of the moment, says Mac.
A reward, yep. Goal/reward, I think, is good. Okay, so in our platform, it's really simple so far. As your first game, all you're doing, and so if you can make jump be fun and interesting, then that's cool. If you've got some sort of consequence, so if you miss your jump, you fall down the hole, and you're like, oh dang, I better make sure I do this jump well. At the moment, we don't really have decision in my little terrible mock-up here, but we might need two paths of how you get there, or maybe you can do a long jump or a short jump. So a little bit of that in terms of decision. And then Tim was talking about keys and doors. So I think the goal, you could either go down the path of having the enemy type goal, where you have, here's a creature you've got to kill to win, or probably an even simpler way of doing it is here's the key you've got to get. How am I going to draw a key? I'll just draw it like that. And then here's the door up here you've got to open with the key. So there's a moment where you're saying to the player, or you're saying to your play tester, or you're saying to yourself, just go from A to B, don't die by falling on the spikes, and get the key. And then after you create this moment, I'd say you would then need to say, what's the next moment? If you can make the next moment with the same mechanics, just with your spikes and your key and your door and your platforms and your player and you jump. So you've already got a ton of stuff in here. You can make another little moment, another little moment, another little moment before you even need to get there and say, right, now I need enemies, or now I need level ups, or now I need power ups, or now I need bonuses.
Well, how would you make this different from another platformer, though? Because this feels,
Good question.
it's not
Let's get
unique.
into that conversation. Two things here. So Tim, question for you. Does it need to be different to other platformers on your very first game? Are you trying to flex that kind of muscle of how do I practice making something different? That's question one. And question two, we can talk about how you'd make it different, but should you try to make it different?
Yeah, I don't think you should. I think there's a lot of people talk about game development and game design, and I think when you're new, a lot of people kind of conflate those two topics together. They think game design and game development are the same thing, but game design is kind of designing a game, or making something different, or making something interesting, or making something unique, right? Making something engaging. Whereas game development is actually building a thing. And I think those are two very big, very different skills. And I don't think that generally you should tackle them at one time, right? So game development is probably something you should learn first. And game development, one of the easiest ways to learn game development is by kind of mirroring other things that have already been designed. So mirroring a platformer when you know how it should work, a lot of times is a better idea than starting with something that you don't know how it should work, right? Because now you're having to work with design problems and development problems, and sometimes you may not know which is which, and sometimes you may not understand the relationship between them. So starting from something that already kind of exists and making your version of that, I think is a good way to start.
And I like what you're getting at there. Do we need to make it different? Good question, Laurie. Maybe rather than looking to make it different, we're looking to make it be good. And how do we look to make it good? You tune the jump height and feel and speed so it feels kind of nice. And it might accidentally end up being exactly like a platformer that you've played before, but that's okay. This is the fundamental of building your game, your very first game, is you want to make it just feel good. And I think we've all played games out there, someone's first game, where they put a bunch of stuff in there and there's a few things that are different. There's some nifty kind of ideas, but it's just not, you pick it up and you're like, this is not enjoyable. I can't jump the way I want to jump. So spend your time and effort just making it feel good. So I've got good here, but feel good is super important. Okay. So that would be my advice for the first game.
From ETM. Yep. Are we talking about our first game in the learning path or the one we want to launch?
Oh, good question there. I think, what did we say at the start? So this is not the first game that you work from a tutorial. This is the first game where you create without following directly from a tutorial. And that can be just for yourself, or it could be something you launch. Now, my recommendation for your game 1, 2, and 3 is game 1, you make just for yourself. So just for me, I'm playing it, I'm making it, I'm going through that motion of whatever, creating a WebGL build or an executable. I can play it. Game 2 is for us. So me and my friends, I might actually try to get it onto itch. I'll tell my friends about it, etc. And then game 3 is about them. So you're trying to publish it. Maybe it's Steam, maybe it's on a console or a handheld, or you're trying to do a Kickstarter, or you're trying to get some momentum for it. So I think, and therefore, if you're going down that path, the game that's just for you, you should be taking weeks, not months and years. The game that's for us is weeks or possibly a month or 2 or 3, but not years again. And the game for them, as long as it needs to, for you to make the thing that you think is compelling. So, so then should you publish your very, very first game? Publish it on sharemygame.com, which is where for GameDev.tv, we can, you can publish your games on there. It's a GameDev.tv hosted, sponsored site. So that you've actually got it live in the real world, but you're not trying to publish it and sell it. Like, publish has 2 meanings. Publish as in it's live to the public, and publish also in terms of I'm trying to do it to sell it, if that makes sense.
I put my tutorial games on Share My Game, and I put like which tutorial I did them on, but I changed them all up so they all had different art. And then I did game jams on itch before I started working on this game. So how do game jams actually fit in with that?
Yeah, it's a good question for you, Tim. You're more of a game jam guru than I am.
So game jams, they for those of you who don't know what game jams is, we should probably start there. Game jams are sort of semi-competitions, but more like events where you're given a certain amount of time, say a weekend or a week, or sometimes a couple weeks, a month, to make a game based on a theme. So when the game jam goes live, they give you a theme and they say, it's our last, I forget what our last game jam theme was, but something based on the idea of like a theme.
Death
and
is
then
not the end, maybe?
What was it?
Death is not the end.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
like
Death is not. Death is only the beginning. That was it. So Death is only the beginning was the theme for our last game jam, right? And then everybody had to make a game based on that theme. So game jams are really great for kind of figuring out everything you don't know about the engine once you kind of start along this path of the old game development, right? So you've done a few tutorials, you've done a few courses, you kind of know you've built a few like little course and tutorial games, but a game jam is kind of this next bigger thing. Now, for some people, it's super exciting, right? They get to make a thing from scratch, and there's a bunch of stuff they don't know, and learning is going to be super exciting to them. Some people, it's terrifying. They're terrified by the things they don't know, and they're worried about the pressure, and they're worried about the timeline and all that stuff. So if the idea of that sounds exciting to you, I think a good next step is to put yourself on this like time pressure and join this thing and try to make a game, right? If it's not something that excites you, I think staying away from that and kind of building on your own time, or especially if you're time limited too, like, not everybody can dedicate a whole week or a whole weekend to making a thing. So that's, something to keep in mind. But I think it can definitely be beneficial, and I think it is beneficial in a lot of ways if you can do it, but it's not for everybody, Rick, I wanted to, while you've been making a mock-up of a game, I've been making a game.
I thought you were saying making a mockery for a second there. I'm like, hey, oh yeah, mock-up. That's fine. Kind of was making a mockery as well. Look at that game. There you go. Whoop.
Wait,
you just made a game?
It's just
I just made it. So
is this my favorite engine?
This is your favorite engine.
Did you make this in
that I've never used in my life?
So we've got our little button, and we've got our door.
You followed the design like authentically. You
designed it. I developed it. I'm telling you, they're two different things.
This is how game studios are formed. Just
So yeah, we don't have a title for it yet, but we can.
Wait, I want to see you unlock the door. Was there a key?
Yeah,
I haven't done that yet, guys. Give me.
I was so excited.
Hold on, let me finish this.
He's like, look, mine moves, but we're not going to talk about that door over there.
Just, guided you away from it.
All right, here's a question that is good.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
I'm going to keep asking you guys these questions. How can you get better at coding practice as you make more games? So I'm not sure if that's like the best practice or if that's just getting better at actually knowing what you're doing.
I think
could be either.
I think everything in life. Tim, you keep concentrating. We want to see that button working.
No, it's already done. I did it. Good.
We've watched you as you're trying to play a game and describe the game, and I see the steam comes out.
For some reason, game development is easier. It's maybe because I spent like a year or two on Twitch making game development, but playing a game is like a different strat.
So I think anything at all you do, if you do it more, you get better at it. So long as you're doing it in a way which is not destructive. But if you're in there making games, you'll get better at coding because you'll see what issues you come across, and then you'll go research how to solve those issues, and you'll try not to do them again, or you try to improve upon it. So there's two aspects. One is the academically, how do you write better code? And we've got a course on that, which is for Unity specifically, but it relates to all programming, which is the programming design patterns, which talks about, using the observer pattern. For example, it talks about using, should you or should you not use singletons. I don't know if Gary's watching, but he's probably like, singletons! And Brian as well. So there's some anti-singleton people out there, but it talks about what you use instead of singletons and why it's not so good. So when you're starting out, when you're working on your first game or two, don't worry about, are you doing it the right way? Is your code good code? I think you should worry about, does it work? So Tim's making a platform at the moment. He's throwing it together. Jump, hit the button, go through the door. You need to have the win of making the game and having it feel good. And the code side of things, whatever. You can tell I'm not a programmer, I'm a designer. So Tim's not, we're not going to have different opinions on this, I don't think. Laurie, hopefully you can put on the hat of, but I'm a programmer and I think it should be this way. But how do you get better at it? You read, you research, you study, but specifically the way I've always found improvement for myself is I have something I don't know how to do, and then I spend hours trying to figure out how to do it, and as a result, I get better at programming. So I might get there and say, cool. I remember I spent hours and hours and hours saying, I just want a character to kick a soccer ball. That's all I want to do. I just want to kick a damn soccer ball and have it go boink that way. And I spent hours and hours and hours just going down the rabbit hole trying to figure it out. And as a consequence, I learned all these various different things about collision and about force, etc. So you need to have a curious mind, and you need to have problems you're trying to solve. And this is why the learning journey that we try to encourage when we're teaching you in our courses is to say, watch what I'm doing, follow what I'm doing, understand what I'm doing. Now I have a challenge for you, is to do a bit of this yourself without just watching what I do. Because then you have to stop and say, how the heck do I figure this out? And you go and dig into all those concepts that you don't understand. So I think that's how you get better at it, is you have an inquisitive mind and you solve problems.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, one of the ways that I was able to learn and make dozens and dozens of games was by, well, one, I did this thing where I sat down and I said, I'm not going to get off stream until I make a game. And I did that 8 weeks in a row, right? So every Friday, called it Finish Friday, and some of those streams were like 10 hours. And I was like, I am so done with this, but I was not allowed to leave the stream until I finished. So that was cool. And then I did a series of game jams, and it's just like, stuff was hard, and it was definitely like a boot camp for game development, but it teaches you a lot, because you start to be like, okay, what's important here? Is the time important here? Or is the outcome important here? Is the code important? Or is getting the dude to jump important? And you learn a lot of little things by just practicing and doing your stuff over and over again, right? So I think it's worth it for any kind of deal. So like this game took years to make, and you run and you jump, you press a button, there's a little particle effects, and you can exit, but you just fall.
Wow. So Tim is now allowed to actually leave the stream, otherwise he'd have to stay.
Yeah, exactly. So I got a lot faster at that, having done that a few times. But I think the fact that I could make it in the span of whatever the 15-20 minutes we're sitting here means that, like, someone that doesn't have an understanding of these tools, doesn't have an understanding of collisions and doors and buttons and particles and all this stuff, it's a good kind of scope to be able to start working on something, right? And working and building it and learning those different skills, because those skills that you learn carry over to other projects in ways that you can't even imagine. So even if you're not interested in a platform, or if you're not interested in jumping or 2D or any of that stuff, those are still skills that carry over a lot of times to your next project. And they carry over in weird ways. Like, you might know where that one button is in that one menu that's just going to save you some time,
Yep. So I wanted to just wrap up the sort of design theory stuff I was talking about by showing. So Tim has made moment 1 in his cool little prototype game that he made there. The moment is, I can move and I can jump and I can push the button and I can go through the door. That's moment number 1. Now Tim needs to make moment number 2, which is taking the same mechanics, maybe adding another feature if he's up for it, and making a different level layout. Maybe, there's a little trampoline you have to bounce on to jump over something high. Maybe he's got the spikes, whatever it might be, moment 2, and then make moment 3, and however many moments he feels his game needs. So, it might be that your goal is to make just a 10-minute game, which is really awesome for 10 minutes. And a lot of people, when you're making your first game or two, won't play your game longer than a few minutes. So they want a quick experience. They're not looking for 10 hours of narrative and backstory and, level ups and all that kind of stuff. So you're making a certain amount of moments, and you're just joining them together. Finish the first, go the second go third, and so on. You might have 5 or 10 or 100 moments. And then you need to wrap it in the game flow. So you need a way to start, some sort of menu that says start now, or push a button. It doesn't have to have fancy UI, but you have to have that experience for the player where they know, okay, I'm about to start a thing. They push the button and then they start. They play through the game. At any point, if they die, they go back to the start. And if at any point they win, they get the finish. And when they get the finish, there's some sort of process. Maybe then you go all the way back to the start. And at any point in here, you can hit the escape button, for example, and you can get to you can escape the game. One of the things that bugs me when I'm playing early games or game jam games where I actually have to force the program to, kill the program. I can't just hit escape and then have it exit. So that's the game flow that you need wrapping around it. And then you can add one more thing that I know this is near and dear to Tim's heart, and that is polish. That relates to all the things. So Tim, could you give us an example in your prototype there? Maybe not, obviously not created it, but can you just talk us through with your example on the screen what you would look for in terms of polish?
Well, I think I you're right in that I couldn't make a prototype without some sort of polish.
Yeah,
So
it's polish. I saw that.
I did a few things. One, the collision boxes for the button when it's on are different than the button when it's off. So actually, when you fall down, you fall down as well.
Oh,
And
yeah.
the other thing is I added the particles for when the lock gets destroyed, right? So sometimes people would just remove the lock, but I actually made this little set of red particles that shows up when the lock gets destroyed. So I added that in just to pull your attention over there and just say, hey, that's a thing that you affected, that you changed, right? That stuff that's not necessary for the design to work, but yeah, I can't touch a prototype without polish, because I think polish is
Yeah.
the stuff that makes it feel better to play, or has some kind of design. Like shooting is a good example, right? A lot of people, when they design a 2D platform where you can shoot, they'll just send all the bullets at the same speed in the same direction, right? That's like the default thing to do. But if you vary the bullet's angle by like 5 degrees up and down like that,
Mhm.
and then you vary their speed ever so slightly, maybe by like 5 or 10%, you get this like barrage of bullets, and it seems like this dude is like running with this gun that's just, and it's
Yeah, I
just so
have
much
noticed
more
that
fun.
actually.
Yeah, it's
It does
so
make
much
a
more
difference.
fun.
That little bit of
Add a
spray.
little bit of screen shake when the bullet hits an enemy, maybe flash them
Yeah.
white, right? Suddenly it's a lot more fun to run around and shoot everything. So a lot of people say you should do polish like near the end. I don't subscribe to that philosophy, because I feel like creating fun things early is important. It's kind of like with Rick's philosophy, is creating that fun moment, right? You want to kind of create something that's kind of standalone and showcases what's fun about this thing really, really early on. And I think a little bit of that polish is important to kind of the design, right?
It's interesting point here from Stim Dealer. Sounds like polish is getting the game from MVP to playable demo. I wouldn't agree with that.
What's an
Precisely,
MVP?
minimum viable product.
There we
Did I
go.
get that right? So I wouldn't
So the minimum of what you make.
I wouldn't agree with that precisely, because what I would say is you either have a vertical slice philosophy or a horizontal slice philosophy. So how to explain this in terms of our MVP. So if you've got a horizontal slice philosophy, you're saying, I'm going to build just the bare minimum of every aspect of my game. So it's a horizontal slice of the feature set. You can think a little bit of the running, a little bit of the jumping, a little bit of the enemies, a little bit of the shooting, a little bit of the game over screen, a little bit of the whatever. That's a horizontal slice. A vertical slice is where you go deep into a narrower amount of things. I should be drawing this rather than using my hands on the screen, but a vertical slice would be if we've got our thing on the screen here, we'd say that's it. There's no more features. There's no more mechanics. We're going to take this and vertical slice this. Let's make the jump feel really good. Let's make particle effects when you get the key. Let's have when you land on the spikes, there's explosions. Let's have sound effects. So you're putting in that polish with this feature set. So your MVP becomes more and more enjoyable. And the definition of a playable demo, I think your game should be playable right from the start. The way Tim's got his game playable straight away. It's not that engaging yet because there's no consequences and there's no there's no real decision, but it's playable. So have your game playable straight away. The terminology playable demo, I think, is more of you can give it out to the public and it's ready. So I would say that philosophy of the playable demo and polish relates to, do you put your love into, let me just get my thingy here. Do you put all your love into, goodness me, use that wrong button. Click on the right thing, sorry. Do you put your love into making this good and polished and amazing and great? Or do you put your love into, like Tim's saying, he wouldn't wait until after you've got all of these things done and then do polish. If I'm guessing right, Tim, you would say, be doing polish on this first moment and get that first moment feeling pretty good.
Absolutely. And it may seem like Rick's diagrams film a little like this, but it's it makes a lot of sense when you think about the word minimum viable product or minimum viable game. Some people say game. A lot of people recognize the minimum word, but they don't think about the viable word, right? And that's where the polish comes in, because you can do the minimum, but the minimum isn't always fun. We talked about the minimum of 2D shooting, right? And the minimum is just having all the bullets at the same speed going the same direction. But to make it viable, you have to make it fun. And one of the ways you can make it fun is by varying the angle of the bullets and varying the speed of the bullets and highlighting the enemies when they get hit and stuff like that. That can be considered polish, but that's part of the viable term in minimum viable product, right? And I think it's super, super important for that part of the viability of the game to add that stuff in. Last little bit here, I think the reason why people recommend you do polish last is because I think people can get stuck there in perfectionism and tweaking and tweaking and tweaking and tweaking. And so that's something you want to avoid. But that's generally why people say you should do polish last, is because they want you to avoid that trap. But I think if you're aware of that trap and you don't get stuck there, I think polish early, I think, can help create a better thing.
Just wanted to touch on this question by Tasty Snack. Is the vertical slice close to the expected final product for a single aspect of the game? Pretty much. And the terminology of single aspect, I would talk about single moment of the game. Now, you're probably not going to get it to final, because as you know, Tim's going into just how much polish do you want to do at a certain point. I think once, so if we're looking at our first moment, then the vertical slice is just putting all of our love into that first moment, one level or one screen or one action that you're taking, that 2-minute experience, if you will. And then as you create the second moment and the third moment, etc., you might add some more features or details or complexity that then your polish needs to expand as well. So you're not going to get everything completed in your first moment or your first little bit of the game, but you want to get it as feeling good as possible, I think would be the terminology. Yes,
I agree. And you may not know what feeling good looks like, right? And that's totally cool. It's part of the whole figuring all this out.
So I think, Tim, you just answered this. Why do you suggest adding the polish to each individual event instead of adding it to the finished product?
Yeah, so let me just dive into this a little bit. I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one is design. So in the game prototype that Rick designed, when you hit the button, the lock disappears, right? The door gets unlocked and all that. Without a little bit of polish, sometimes you may not notice that the door unlocked, or you may wonder what happened, or you may be focusing on the button. Your eyes can literally be looking at the button, you jump on it, and then you don't realize what happened because your eyes weren't focused on the door. So a little bit of polish, like particles, can actually have a design effect. It can pull your eye away from where you're at to where you need to be, and it can have like an intended effect, which makes the whole game a little more playable. So design is important, but the other part of it is game feel. And game feel has two purposes: one for you as a developer to kind of stay excited about your project, right? Because you want to make stuff that's cool and fun to play. The other is the player, the person that's going to be playing your game, and it's very common for people to leave polish out of their kind of minimal prototypes. And when you do that, people that don't understand game development or don't kind of play stuff like this, when you hand it to them, it feels flat and it doesn't feel like as good as it can. And I think it can be discouraging for some people because they'll just be like, I don't like it. And they won't verbalize why they don't like it, because they don't know why they don't like it, but it just may not feel quite as good as it should. And again, you can tweak it infinitely, but I'm talking about a little bit of polish. I'm not saying get lost. I'm not saying spend 90% of your time budget on polish. I'm just saying, add a particle to your door here and there.
Would you add sound effects into polish, and sound effects, music, particles, screen shake? And it's a little bit of the question that's being asked by where's it gone? By Joshua. When do you move to the next moment? So if we look back at your little prototype game MVP you've got there, how much polish would you add to that before you get there and say, I'm pretty happy with this moment, pretty happy with these mechanics here. I'm now going to go and make another level, or I'm now going to add a different level with a different feature to it. So what would you, maybe you can bring that up so we can look at it. What would you be adding to it before you say we're done?
So I've done this a few times. So if this was a game I wanted to pursue, I would do the art and I would do the sound first before I pursued a next level.
So you do all of the art, so it's finished, final. This is the exact character and the animations you want, and the jump and the spring. So you get the character looking awesome, and you get the platforms looking awesome, and you get the particle effects looking awesome, and you get the sound effects looking awesome. Am I correct in how you would approach that?
So I need to make a caveat because my answer would be yes, but when you say it like that, it seems like a waterfall type of approach to game development where I've designed everything up front and then everything afterwards just kind of comes to me, and that's not always the case, right? So there's a lot of iterative and changes and things that happen afterwards. But I'm a very vertical slice kind of guy. So I like to understand what the game is that I'm making before I expand it to more content, right? So a level to me is additional content. If I were to make an additional level to this, I'd want to understand what the game is that I'm going for. So we've got a little vibe here with this little dude and his little hair and his little jump. I'd want to understand the rules of this system primarily. So the jump is a really good example. How high can this guy jump, right? On a grid system, like next to this thing, he can't actually walk under this thing. Is that a thing that I would allow in other levels, or should you always be able to go under the thing? You jump, should you be able to jump up one platform or two platforms? This is a double platform. Shouldn't I be able to jump up there? No. Things like that.
Do you need a double jump? At this stage, you might say,
Right.
oh, I can't jump all the way up there. Is double jump important to my game? Yes or no? And
Right.
if it is important, you might want to code up the double jump now before you move on to the next moment per se.
Right. And so I got to give a caveat again, like having done this, who knows, like 100 times, a vertical slice idea of this game would be a weekend game for me. That's the scale it would be. It would be, 2 days I'd spend on this. And I would go ahead and do the art. And the art would take me a couple hours, 4 to 5 hours of doing different art, doing backgrounds, doing all this. Sound effects would take me another hour or two. And I would perfect the jump. I would perfect the movement. I would perfect all of this. And then I would move on to level design. After I understand the jump and the spatial relationship, and I've got the character controller feeling really good. Now, the reason why I bring up the time aspect is because it's not going to take everybody a weekend. This might be a month game for some people, right? Like it might, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that some people don't understand like how the tools work, or like, there are different levels of their game development journey. That's totally cool. But the longer your initial project is, the bigger it is, the bigger the scope, the more kind of room you have for things to go wrong, the more you can get lost in scope creep, the more crazy stuff can pop up. So if you think that this game could take you, a week and you haven't really made a game before, you might want to try a game that you think you can do in an afternoon, because that's likely to take you a month. So
I really like, I'm a fan of the onion design. I've talked about this in a few of the courses, but the thing you create first is the very most important aspect of your game, which in this game is going to be movement, character movement. And then you get it to the point where you're happy with it. So if character movement requires a double jump, then you create the double jump before you move on to creating your platforms and your levels. And you lock in what's in the middle. You say, this is locked in stone. And because when you go back and change something fundamental with your game that you've already assumed is finished, then everything, it has some massive effects. And double jump is a perfect example. Jump height is a perfect example.
Exactly.
You want to lock that in.
And so if you think about it, there are some things mechanically that you can change, or just game-wise. There's some things you can change later, and there's some things you can't. Jump height, and I've done this. This is personal experience. I had a platform that I worked 4 years on. 3 years into it, I decided the character controller wasn't right, and I needed to increase the jump height. Well, when I did that, I had to retweak 65 levels by hand and make sure that, some jumps were accessible with one jump, some jumps were accessible with two jumps, some gaps were perfectly spaced, all that. So jump height in a platformer is one of those things that you can't really change without a whole bunch of work down the line. Whereas I could swap out the art, no problem, right? Like I could swap out the sound effects, no problem. So stuff that doesn't have these kind of cascading waterfall consequences, I tend to focus less on in the beginning, just because I can change them at any time. But stuff like the movement and jump speed, that's stuff that has other consequences if I don't pay attention to it up front.
Now, we were teasing Laurie a little bit for saying let's make a puzzle game as our first game, because it's like, oh, what does that mean? What I would find useful, and maybe to fit with the theme of our topic that's scrolling across the screen ongoing, to remind us get back to the topic. That's actually good to remind us to stay on topic. Is what game should I make first? We've dug deep into one type of game and talked about the philosophy you should have. What else do you think makes for a good first game for someone who's followed a couple of tutorials and is ready to say, I'm going to make this myself? The first thing I would say is, if you've gone and followed a tutorial where you've made a particular genre of game, that's the perfect game to go and make as your first game that you make on your own, because you've already got a bit of a head start. You've already figured a few things out. You already know some of the mechanics. So if you go through a 2D platformer tutorial, go have a 2D platformer as your first game. I think that's really a cool thing to do. However, what could be some good topics here? So some good genres of games to make as your very first game?
At the risk of sounding like a broken record and like, just one of the cliche advice dudes, I think basic games like Block Breaker and that type of stuff are really good because they're simple enough to not include scrolling screens and complex physics or anything like that. It's just like kind of blocks and a ball and a moving paddle. Even Pong is like a super simple version of that. Like, can you get the ball moving right? But then you can turn Pong into Block Breaker later on down the road. So that's cool.
I like what you're saying, because that's a single screen layout. You're not having to worry about scrolling cameras, which is cool.
Games where the interface is something that you understand. So for example, if you've done like drag and drop before in Unity, making a game where you can just drag and drop stuff, something super simple can be
drag
easy.
And drop's a bit of a pain in Unity, but
not specifically drag and drop, but I'm saying stuff you're familiar with, like you were saying 2D platform. If you've done a 2D platformer tutorial, a lot of people would try to start a new genre because they've already done 2D platform, but by trying to make one without the tutorial, I think you'll learn a lot more, right?
I think
I did a couple of.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say I did a couple of 2D platformers for my game jams, which I thought were fun, but I realized they weren't really my thing. Like, I wasn't dying to make more of them. I think that's another good way to try it, just to make short little games to see what you enjoy making.
Yep. I've said first-person horror. So first-person, I think you can set up in certainly Unity and Unreal has fairly easy controls. You don't need to worry about your character animation or what your character looks like. So you get a big advantage. As soon as you make a third-person game, then you need to make sure you've got good assets for the character and it all, the run looks good, etc. But first-person, you can just have the camera moving around. I say horror as a game because then you can play with lights, which are fairly easy to do as a first game. And it can be a little bit more about find the thing, avoid the thing. You're not dealing with shooting. If it's a first-person shooter, you need to worry about ammo and pickups and changing weapons and health and spawning, etc. But if it's a first-person horror, then it's about lighting and guiding, a little bit puzzly, but doesn't have a lot of the more complicated systems, I don't think. So I like that as a first game to make. I also like very simple tower defense. And in our I don't know if so in our Unity 3D course, Gary teaches how to make a tower defense with simple pathfinding, etc. So that's something that you can totally take it in whatever directions you want once you've learnt those core mechanics of the tower defense. What else do you think is a first game for someone to work on?
I put one up that Justin suggested, a text-based adventure.
Yeah, that's a good one. Text-based adventure, yep.
And what are those story games? Those might be interesting. Like, if you're really into story, if you want to go for something that's like, what are they called? Visual novel. That's it.
Visual novels, yeah.
Would that be a good one to make first?
What's the tool that you can use that in?
Twine.
Spline. I was going to say Stripe.
Twine.
Yeah, Spline.
TWINE.
Yeah. So there's some tools you don't necessarily have to use. Yeah. Well, let me just take that back. So if you want to get better at Unity, you should probably use Unity, not go off and make something in an engine just to make your first game. but that's something we could talk about as well, because making your first game in Construct 3, I think or in Scratch is easier than making your first game in Unity or Unreal. There's less for you to have to learn and figure out technically. But at some point, you get to the point where you say, oh, I can't do all the things that I want to do. But making a simple platformer in Construct 3 is quite simple, quite straightforward.
It's a great engine. Yeah.
Yep.
Good old Flappy Bird clone. Probably a good one. That's a good one.
Laddie, Elizabeth had a good one.
No.
The first game you should make is similar to Battle Barn Tactics. Actually, I downloaded and played the demo, and it was really fun.
She's lying. But
it was it really actually.
Nobody should make games like Battleborn Tactics until after I've launched and made millions, and then
that's probably
and then rip it off. I think.
What is the one that? Oh, I did an Endless Runner for a game jam. What's the one that actually lets you make a visual novel? Isn't there a one that's actually built for just doing that, where you put in the art and the?
I think it's Twan.
I thought there was
probably. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also,
super basic games. Good idea.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
One of my favorite all-time games to make and to play is a top-down shooter. We teach top-down shooter in the Unity 2D course. Top-down shooter, or a shmup, as it might be called, like a shoot-'em-up or a bullet hell. Because basically, move a thing, left, right, up, down, scroll a background, have enemies spawn, have lots of bullets. So I think it's the kind of thing that you can have something visually interesting as your very first game.
How do those work out with the mechanics? I was wondering that earlier when we were talking about shooting, because I know I play a lot of shooter games, and it really matters how they feel. Is that a harder genre? I mean, I'm doing a puzzle game, but I'm still asking. Is that a harder genre to get the feel right?
Which genre?
The shooter, even as a roguelite, like don't you want a specific feeling when you're doing it?
Top-down.
I would say top-down. Does top-down have a different vibe to it than that?
I think they all can have any vibes that you want to give them.
Like
right?
you have to worry as much about your mechanic being tight when you're doing a top-down?
The thing is, I would, when you're first starting out, you're not really going to have a good sense of what, well, maybe you are. If you're like a super fan of the genre, you would know kind of the intricacies of how this stuff feels. But I think any one of these games, you're not going to have a super solid sense of game feel. I think it's more evident on a top-down shooter. It's more likely to feel flat than something like a tower defense or a block breaker Pong game, right? Because there's less polish involved to make it feel good. But that being said, it could be a good example to kind of learn how to tweak variables and learn how to, really make stuff feel good.
Arcade 2D racing game, like the ones back in the olden days in the arcade, where it's just a single screen and turn left, turn right as you're driving around, hit some jumps and have a race. I think that's kind of cool. A third-person adventure. Now, as soon as you say shooting, once again, you need enemies and all that kind of aiming and raycasting. If it's third-person adventure, it's pretty similar to the first-person horror, but it's a little bit more with the jumping and platforming and finding the key in mind. I think not too bad. So, I mean, we could probably list 1,000 more.
Yeah,
I really
here's another one.
games.
Hyper casual is a good way to go.
Oh yeah, hyper casual.
From Morbo.
So, how would you define hyper casual, Laurie?
Oh, we're defining now?
Yeah.
I would say something where someone's just out to chill for a little bit instead of actually accomplish something. Like when I load up Apex and I just want to accomplish a win.
I would say
casual games are more a little bit time.
Yeah.
Tim disagrees.
No, actually, I agree with you. I just wanted to expand on your point. I think something like one-button controls, something that's simple, something maybe with abstract shapes.
Even for mobile,
Yeah, like something super simple, super constrained, touchscreeny, single screen, that kind of stuff. It's good to put some of these constraints on you too when you're new to game development as well, because it's very easy for your one little idea to turn into a giant MMO without you knowing it. And if you put constraints in like one button controls, then suddenly there's so many things you can't do. And while that may seem discouraging, it's actually can end up encouraging, because now you are kind of locking in your scope and you're saying this game cannot be bigger than what one button can do. And so because of that, I think you're more likely to finish and kind of carry through with it.
So I wanted to just yes, okay.
You got to get Draggy Dog in there. Thank you, Elizabeth.
Draggy Dog. There we go. Fan service.
Right, that,
We'll do
yes.
it. I wanted to put in here some of the things that you should avoid. Personally, I think for a first game, or even second, third, fourth game, probably, I would absolutely 100% avoid online multiplayer. Multiplayer as your first game or second game or third game, for a few reasons. One, it's really, really, really technically difficult to do. It's good as a later game, and we're at the moment we're creating a new Unity multiplayer course, so we're going to be teaching you how to create a game with the same sort of flavor as, although no promises yet. Oh crap, I just promised a thing. But we're creating something a little bit more in the flavor of Agario, that's a bit more lots of people doing things at the same time. It's good as a second or third game, but if you're at the point where you're still like, how do I make a platformer, make a couple of those first. The other reason I think you need to be really careful is if you're looking to make this and then publish it and have a lot of people play it, that becomes a very, very, very difficult marketing and sales job, because if you've got a game that relies upon other people being there to play it and no one else is there yet to play it, then the first person comes along, it's empty, they don't come back. It's a little bit, oh God, is it too soon to make these jokes? It's a little bit metaverse. It's like, hey, the metaverse, where is everyone? $15 billion of development and
it's too early.
$700 billion of stock value. So anyway, maybe in 5 years' time, people will play this clip and be like, Rick, you called it wrong. But at the risk of sounding a little bit and totally derailing the conversation, I've been not very bullish on metaverse for a long time and haven't really seen it as a game changer. It's kind of nifty as opposed to we're all going to be living in the metaverse. But anywho,
I think people want it more like the moment idea. People want something that they're doing, even if it's a metaverse. I feel like if they have a goal, it changes the whole feel of something. So I feel like that's something that's missing with the metaverse. Is it's just like wander around and find something to do. People want goals and things to do. Planned out things.
Something else I would add to the don't make list is a systems heavy or procedural type of game, like Factorial or ProcGen or anything like that. Those games, talk about moments, they require a lot of systems to even get a moment. So
what is a procedural generation game exactly? Because I know I used it for like a game jam, so it's not like that, but what would it be?
So any
I used
game
it for
that
levels.
kind of randomly generates their levels or things like that. There's a lot of reasons, design reasons and technical reasons. One, technically, it's usually harder to figure out how to build an algorithm than to just hand build a level, right? Usually more time consuming. But design wise, you'll start to realize when you procedurally generate stuff that you have to really understand what the level should be to properly procedurally generate them. And usually you do that by building out a bunch of levels by hand. And if you're going to build out a bunch of levels by hand, it's your first game, you probably should just stick to that. That makes sense.
Yeah, and again, procedural generation games are amazing and can be very, very commercially successful. But when we're talking about your first game that you're putting out there or you're completing or you're showing, avoid it. System heavy games, can we define that to be more precise? If someone's very new, they might be like, I don't even know what system heavy means.
Yeah.
How do we make it tangible for a beginner to know what system heavy means?
Okay, so if the way that I would look at it is a game like, I don't know, like Factorial is probably a good example, or RimWorld, or games that are more simulations, if that makes sense.
Right.
So if there's a hunger system, if there's a mining system, if there's a crafting system, if there's all these different, like a rain system, a fire system, right? And then the rain puts out the fire, but the fire turns wood into coal. Those systems are complex to build, and then they all require each other to function, right?
Yes.
So you you have to build those systems independently, and then you have to build all of them to see their effect on each other. And because of that, the prototype for those games can take months, if not years. So it's something you want to avoid if possible, because it can just be a rabbit hole of unknowns, and you can never get anything out of it.
I'd also define it as something, if you need a big spreadsheet to figure out what's going on, to have all your tuning values. On level 1, you get this, and level 7, that. But if you've got the fire spell, you this, and then if they've got this, they've got that. Then if you need a spreadsheet to manage what's going on, then it's going to be bigger than you should take on for your first game. And I think that also, similarly, that fits with like an RPG. And we know from experience, because we spent 5 years creating and teaching an RPG. And the reason... So if you just create a third-person open-world combat game, not a problem. Like, it's probably a little bit big for your first game, but you could totally do it. You know, run around, click, kill, you know, have some health, have some enemies, great. You can totally do that. But as soon as you say RPG, people expect dialogue, quests, player progression, items. So then you have these interdependent systems that just get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you make an RPG where all you do is sort of run around and hit things on the head, that's not an RPG, and people are going to get upset if you pretend that it is. So yeah.
So are you saying open world games would be okay then? I feel like
well, for me, open world games
is Morbo, or one of the ones Morbo suggested.
Yeah, Morbo, good question. Open world games for me is more about the level design. The word open world for me is a level conversation, level and camera. So Tim before was making a fixed camera, single screen platformer, but he would probably, as he worked on his game, he would probably expand that to make it a scrolling camera so that his levels can be bigger and more interesting. But one of the things we've got on here is the Block Breaker Pong. It's a fixed camera. That means you don't have to worry about camera. It's just everything's happening in this one screen. If you're making a first-person shooter, you're running around in what essentially is either a first person or third person, any 3D sort of games where you're running around. You're either saying you're running down the corridor and there's one door and then another corridor, another door, maybe there's 2 doors. So it's a very closely curated level where you've got to go from A to B in this level. That's more of a level-based A to B design. Open world, I would say, here's the character, here's the dome around the world, and you can do stuff within that. And it could be you need to run over there, kill these things, run over there, pick up the stuff, run over here, get the whatever. I think that's totally valid. That's a level design decision. Usually, though, open world, we connect with GTA or World of Warcraft, where it's a massive game with a lot going on.
A system-heavy RPG, yeah.
That's right.
Online.
Yeah, but I think if you make that distinction, you can have a very small multiplayer open world game. I think this is my definition of it anyway, where there's no door in, no door out. It's more like a sandbox of a world, and you're doing stuff within that, and it could still not be too intensive from a first game point of view.
Can I interject with a question from, I'm not trying to pronounce it, Kareem? What's an example of a first-time simple game that has been successful in the market? Do we have an example? I'm not really sure. I know that Celeste was actually based on a game jam, a short-term game, the Pico game.
Side note, hi Kareem, good to have you join us. I was chatting with Kareem just recently. Maybe Kareem will make a course with us. An example of a first-time simple game that has been successful in the market. It's kind of tough to know, isn't it? Because I don't see that as often part of the marketing where someone will say, this is my first game. So the games that tend to be media worthy in terms of having a big splash aren't usually a first game. Games that could have been a first game, the one I always go back to is Crossy Road. And the developers had the goal of making that in a very quick, 5 or 6 weeks to make the core game. So I like it from that point of view. That certainly wasn't their first game, though, but it could have been their first game, if that makes sense. Tim, can you think of anyone who's had a first game that this is the very first game I've ever made and it's done well?
So I think quite the opposite of that. We're seeing a lot of people posting stuff in the chat with different, different names of games like Angry Birds and Super Hot and all this
Angry
stuff.
Birds
and
was game number 50, and Flappy Bird made a ton of games already.
This is the thing. it's a lot of people think the first game they ever heard of was somebody's first game, and that's almost never true, right? Um, I think being successful financially in a market is too much to ask for a first simple game. I think you're setting yourself up for failure there, and disappointment and pressure and all kinds of stuff. Because the other thing is, games don't actually have a definition. Have you ever actually tried to define what a game is? It's harder than it seems, right? So is what I made a game right there? Is it complete? Has an objective? Some people would say yes, some people would say no. Our story
It's my
is
favorite game, personally.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, I'll continue on and put it on Steam. We'll see how it does. So I think, I don't think there is an example out there, and I don't think I don't think that should be something you strive for, because I think if you're thinking like that, your scope is already too big. If you're thinking, I want a first simple, successful game, you're already putting way too much pressure on the thing you're making.
I think there's people out there who have started early in their game development journey and then made a game for a long time. It's a bit dumb. I forget the guy's name, but we had someone on a few months ago, Tim, who was making that big space game that was
Falling Frontier or something like that.
Yeah,
Falling Frontier. Yeah, he'd been working on that for like 10 years, but it might be his first game. But in a way, it's not, because he's made it 7 times along the way. Right. So what you might see, to Kareem's question, I've seen people who have worked on a student project that they've then turned into a game. But it might have been they made that, then they went and made some other games, then came back to the student project, or it evolved, or more people got participated in it. Okay, I've got one, but I don't know if it's their first game. A student project that ended up being huge was Portal. So was that their first game? Quite possibly. And
it's how you define it, though, right? Because Portal was a student project, and then Valve hired everybody on the Portal team to work. It wasn't called Portal; it was called something else.
Yeah, exactly.
To make it, and then they gave them a bunch of professional game designers and narrative designers and everything else to help them make it. And it's a project of like 100 people or something like that. So I think it was 10 or 12 on the core team.
Important about this question, sorry, Tim, is successful. Like, for your first game, what is successful? Is it actually like 10 people liking it? Right. Is it 100 people liking it? If I make a game and 200 people download, I might be happy if it's my first simple game I make.
The word first, what does that mean? The word simple, what does that mean? The word successful, what does that mean, right? So, it's too broad of a question, I think.
There's a good question from Jamie, one of our team members. Jamie, would VR games be considered difficult first game to make? Which is cool, linking it to Kareem, because Kareem might help us make some VR games in Unity, which would be really cool. I think it's time that we spend some time in that. Personally, I'd say no, a VR game wouldn't be considered difficult to make as your first game, because, and again, hopefully we'll have a course teaching this soon, but if you're competent in Unity and then you learn how VR works in terms of, here's literally how I build it out so that it becomes a VR game, and then you pay attention to the controls, then it's about what's an interesting experience to make within there. And a lot of the games that we've talked about before, like a third-person horror type game, or a first-person adventure platformer type thing, I think you can make those in VR. And I think the opportunity to have it stand out in VR, there's still a market for that. There's still a lot of people out there saying, I've got a headset and I wish I had more stuff to play. And so I think if you can make something interesting, then people will be interested in playing it. So if you've got a headset and you love VR and you're really interested in it, then I think, yes, you can absolutely make VR as your first game. But again, keep it really, really simple. You're in a room, how do you get out? You're solving a murder mystery. You're interacting with the world in an interesting way. Don't try to make something that's too action heavy, because, well, maybe I should retract that statement as well, because the early kind of VR games were, you've got your thingy hitting the drum, kind of Guitar Hero style. That could be a game you could make. So, all right. Would you guys agree with my conclusions on VR?
I think AR is actually really interesting. That's something that's caught my interest, but I didn't actually know if it was viable to get into early on.
I don't have a lot of experience with VR, AR stuff, but from some of the YouTube videos and stuff I've seen, there are like packages and templates and stuff that you can get stuff up and running pretty quick. So if you got the character controller stuff working with the headset, it's just like making another game at that point.
Yeah, cool. Okay, awesome. So we're at the stage of our conversation today. I think we've listed a bunch of things not to make on your first game. We've listed a bunch of things that you could work on for your first game. We've given a couple of examples of how to have a moment philosophy. So here's how you look at moments. And we've talked about joining moments together, paying attention to polish when you're on your first game. And also, where did I write that? Over here. Focusing on, this is something for me. And I might share it with my friends. I might share it with the GameDev.tv community. I might put it up on itch. Certainly put it up on sharemygame.com. Let me see if I can show that just quickly. So, sharemygame.com. So I'm trying to type in one that's getting in the way. So if you guys don't know about, you folks don't know about sharemygame.com, you can head over there, and this is where you can host your games for free. You can then share it with people. It's a nice, easy, friendly way to upload it. You can check out other people's stuff. So this is literally from one of our courses, the 2D Unity course. Someone's got there and made Snowboarder and followed along. And this is a really great way to get into that habit of publishing what you create. So it's not just saying, I'll keep it on my computer and never show someone. This is now out in the world, so people can see it, people can find it. And so Claudiu, with lots of numbers and letters after it, has made a thing. And that thing is now out there in the universe, and people can comment on it, and people can play it, etc. So I think this is a really powerful way to make your first game and to have it get out there in the real world, so that you can feel that whole cycle of made it, developed it, got it done, published it. I think that's great.
I had stuff up there right way after I started the 2D course. I got some stuff up there. It really was enjoyable, and then sending it to my friends and being like, look, I made a game.
Yeah,
it really does encourage you.
It's great, and it's really, really important, and we talk about this so much on your first game. Expect that you'll have fun making it, and you'll learn some things. That's it. Don't expect anything else from it. Don't expect anyone to say, what a great game, because they may not. And don't expect anyone to cheer that you did it, because they may not. If you send it to your friends, you want them at least to say, cool, wow, I didn't know you were doing that. Like, keep it up. That's great.
My friend wasn't like that, though. He was more like what you said. I was like, I made stuff like that on my calculator. I'm like, I'm making this in Unity. You don't understand. I have a plan. I'm not on my calculator like you were. Like, yeah, but it's the same kind of thing where you just have to keep going no matter what you get back.
Exactly. And you'll show it to them, and they won't realize just how difficult it is to do this. And they'll look at it and say, this is nothing like every other game that I've seen or played. This is not there yet. And you're like, do you have any idea of how long it took me to get to this point? So that's a really important part of the process, and just expect it. People are going to be dumb when you show it to them.
That's one of the reasons why I wouldn't recommend trying your first game as your first commercial game, because those are two completely different fields. Like, trust me, the technical achievement of making your first thing is very different than the technical, intellectual, commerce, achievement of putting something on Steam and releasing it, and UX and UI and bug reports, and it's just so much more involved. And just on a motivational level, like, you put it up and nobody buys it, or you put it up and people review it in 1 star, like that stuff, that it's super fun to go through, but you want to go through it later, right? After you've got
game
got
number
a few things
3.
under your belt.
Game number 3 is where you say, I'll try to make some money out of this, not game number 1 or game number 2. And if they accidentally make money, hooray! But you don't want to go chasing that, because there's a lot you need to improve, I think, or get there.
This is unrelated, but this is super important to me. Jamie asks, is it possible to end up disliking the game despite it actually not being that
bad? Is it possible to not end up disliking your game, I think is the question.
I end up hating most of the things I make. And I think it's normal. I think a lot of people they're not prepared for that, right? They're not prepared for making a thing that they're super excited about and it turning it into a thing that they hate, and then they chase that high of liking the thing, so they just add more stuff to it, and then it just becomes this giant complex mess. Then you don't even want to look at it, and then you don't want to look at your computer. And maybe I'm projecting here, I don't know, maybe it's just my experience, but it can be a cycle that you have to be prepared for. So it's one of the reasons why scope is so important, because the smaller you keep it, the more likely you are to kind of avoid it taking long enough to end up something you hate. That makes sense.
A good question here from Lottie: how would you build a following with your first simple game? I would say don't try to, but what you are looking for are some allies and some friends. And this is important because I was watching yesterday a Mr. Beast video. I don't know if everyone knows Mr. Beast, but he's gigantic YouTuber making just billions of dollars, just doing so well. And he talks about in the early days where he had 3 or 4 other YouTubers that were starting out, tiny channels, and they talked, they shared, they bounced ideas, they critiqued each other, they were honest with their feedback. And as a result, they all learned from each other and it sped up his progress. So if you're making your first simple game, rather than looking to build a following, look to build allies. Look to find someone else who's making their first simple game and say, hey, here's what I thought about your game. Do you want to have a look at my game? Or, hey, do you want to bounce ideas for the next game? You don't necessarily work on it together because that's a big commitment. That's like, going from first online date to getting married is joining each other on a team. But you want to find folks that you can talk to that can support you for the next 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 years as you're going down this journey. So get plugged in to the indie game developer community. That's the sort of following you want from your first game or 2 or 3.
I will, and sorry to be a downer here every time we ask these questions, but there is something that happens psychologically too when you take a thing like art that you're making and then you put it in a scenario where its results are quantifiable, right? So when you sell it and then you get X amount of dollars, when you put it on Twitter and you get X amount of likes, right? Suddenly this thing that you're proud of or that you're happy of only got 17 of that fake currency, and therefore it's not worth the 40 that other person got, right? So it's one of those things that I think you should really consider why you make games. And a lot of people say you should build a following, you gotta do this, you gotta do marketing, you gotta do that, but you don't have to do any of that. You can just make games because it's fun, right? Like you can just make it. Like I'm into modifying cars and stuff, and everybody will tell you like, oh yeah, I want to modify it, sell it and do all this stuff, but like nobody ever gets out the money that they put into their car. Let's be real, the parts cost way more than the car's worth. Even after you put the parts on the car, they're worth less. Like that's how it works.
I would agree with that. The best experience, the most fun I've ever had making games as a game developer was when I was way a million years ago back at game design school, and we were all making games in Unreal Tournament, I think it was called at the time, making levels. And we were all trying to make a better level so that we were in a room full of, folks. There were 10 of us, and we'd all jump in and play someone's level, multiplayer deathmatch. And it was incredibly fun. And we're all trying to make the best experience. And one of the guys in our room, Nick, made something called Murder Box, and it was amazing. And we just played Murder Box for hours because the peekaboos to shoot with the rocket were perfect. The ramps were great. And that for me was like, that was being a game developer, and it had nothing to do with commercial success, following, launches, all that. It was just, that was the joy of it. And I think if you can capture that joy with some friends, that's amazing. And then maybe one day you say, look, I want to be a professional and do this as a living. And at that point, you need to make some decisions, and you need to really change your philosophy of what you're doing and why. But I like what you're saying, like make them because you're like, that was really cool. Look, I can jump, wow, I can fly. This is amazing. So
I also want to mention what Crazy Pantaloons said about the Blender channel. I'm very much into the Discord, and I have friends that were literally made friends because we were doing the Blender course at the same time and we were on the same things. And now we've known each other for a while, and now like he literally just told me about an add-on I didn't know about that was really great, and I added it to my It's like when you get to know people who are in the same situation as you, it really helps. There's people who can help you along the way. And our Discord's great for that. All the different social medias through GameDev.tv. Just going to push that because I love our Discord.
It's pretty great.
Yeah, Discord, that's great. And you know, while we're on that topic, make sure you give more than you get when it comes to contributing, because if you've got this philosophy, I'm going to work on my game, I'll throw it out there, hey, who wants to help me with my game, who wants to give me feedback, you haven't necessarily built up the points, the street cred to be able to do that. So if you're talking, participating, contributing, you're like, oh, that person's cool, hey, I have a good chat with that person, hey, I see that person every time, then you're contributing. And when it comes time to saying, I'm really stuck here, who can help me out, people are ready because you've been part of that. So that's the best part of this whole community, is having people to talk to. So it's not just you sitting at your lonely desk working on your lonely game. That's a recipe for not succeeding, I think.
Yeah.
Cool. So any last questions you found in there, Laurie? One or two we can take before we wrap it up. And Tim, do you remember your first game, Tim? It's kind of tough after a while to be like, was that my first game? Was that my first game?
See, it depends. Again, it depends on what the first game is.
Right.
When I was like 15 years old, I played Halo, and it inspired me, and so I wrote out a trilogy of an FPS game that I was going to make called Project Exodus, and I worked for months on building this whole thing, and it was just kind of a generic shooter, and it didn't really make any sense. But I had a trilogy worth of stuff to do. But I remember the first game I actually finished was just a little box that it would ask you what your name was, and then you type in your name, and then it would just give you the little box. There's nothing else to do except you would go in the box, and then you fall down, and then it would make fun of your mom. It would say whatever name you typed in was like Tim's mom is whatever. And that was what I made when I was like 12, and that was like one of the first things I ever did. Yeah. Probably couldn't
Laurie,
get made
do you remember
these
your
days.
first game?
Well, initially, I didn't really think I had a first game, but now that I'm thinking about it, I have done those game jams, and there was a lot that I learned through it. I did a 4-day was my first game jam I did, and I decided to do a platformer, and I just freaked out, and it was like, I don't remember how to do these player controls, so I actually used your tutorial to help with my character movement, and I do pixel art because I had done the pixel art course, and it was really fun when I put it together and put it on the web. All the UI is all messed up, like it's on my itch, but it was really, like, for me, a big thing that I did all the art and all the, like, following a tutorial, but all of the other stuff I added double jumping and then didn't actually use it. I added a lot of different things to it too. It was really, really great. But it still doesn't really work right because I never really fixed the UI. Like, you click through it and you're like, what did that say?
Yeah, exactly. That's the joy of it. You've got to have your first game's got to have a computer bricking bug that happens 3/4 of the way through it, that you're fearful because you've launched it, it's out there, and then you're like, oh my goodness, I hope no one finds that bug. I think that's part of the joy.
Yeah, it was beautiful on Unity, and then I uploaded it and I was like, why does none of this fit? I think I didn't use the right, like, screen thing, but it made it even funnier. It was so fun for me though.
Cool. Well,
Best times.
Good times. Thanks for it's been excellent engagement and conversation and stuff from our community today. So thanks everyone for hanging out and watching. And my first game was Hello World. That's a good game.
I know. That was my first game too.
Elizabeth. So thanks for all the input today. If you're watching this not live, then please throw questions and comments and stuff in there, and join the community. Come over to Discord, hang out with these lovely folks that are in the community, and support each other. Tim, thanks for the wisdom and the input as always. Laurie, thank you for wisdom and input as always, keeping us in check. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Wonderful to be talking about our first games.